Hi, and welcome to our seventh mental chat. Today, I will be joined by my first ever guest, Professor Joanna Moncrieff, who works as a psychiatrist in the NHS and is a professor of Critical and Social Psychiatry at University College London. Together, we will review the current dominant theory of mental distress, the theory of the chemical imbalance in the brain, and we will have a closer look at the evidence for it and at the common pros and cons of psychiatric medications so that you can make an informed choice. This is an essential episode to listen to, so stay tuned. Hi, I'm Alice. I'm the clinical director of Crossroads Psychology. With over 20 years of experience, have helped hundreds of people improve their lives. And this is the first podcast to show you how to apply the principles of scientifically proven psychological models such as CBT, mindfulness, and ACT to get unstuck. Because change starts from within. You're listening to the Mental Chats podcast. Welcome back. So, without further ado, let me introduce you to Professor Joanna Moncrieff. Hi, Joanna.
Hello, Alice. Thank you for inviting me on.
Thank you for coming to our Mental Chat podcast. And would you like to introduce yourself to the listener?
Yes, I'm a professor of social and critical psychiatry at University College London, and I work as a psychiatrist in the NHS in London as well.
Okay, brilliant. And I know you've written a few books, and I've read one of yours, and I'm planning to read another. But from the one I've read, I know or I've learned that you have a very alternative view of mental health issues and how they are conceptualized and the role of medications in the management of mental health. Would you like to explain it to us?
Yes, so most of my work has focused on psychiatric medications, so that's drugs like antidepressants, antipsychotics, anxiolytics like Valium and Librium, and what we call mood stabilizers. And the central idea that I have been trying to get across is that there is no evidence that any of these drugs work by targeting an underlying brain abnormality such as a chemical imbalance or any other abnormal process, and that there's another way of explaining what they do when people take them for mental health problems, and that is that they change our normal mental states, and they do that by changing our brain chemistry and our normal brain activity, and the alterations that they produce can suppress or supersede people's underlying emotional difficulties, underlying feelings.
Okay, so let me see if I understood correctly. So it's not that the medication target a specific disease or abnormality. It's just that the medication creates an alternate conscious state that counteracts the one that is of anxiety, of depression, or others.
Yes, so if we think of something like antidepressants, for example, the traditional way of understanding them or explaining what they do has been this idea that depression is caused by an underlying deficit of serotonin, and the drugs specifically replenish the serotonin levels and thereby help to normalize the brain. And what I'm saying is that they don't do that at all, because there's no evidence that there's any serotonin abnormality or any other abnormality for that matter. We might come on to that. But what they do is they change our brain chemistry and they produce mental and physical changes. And one of the mental changes they produce, for example, is a feeling of emotional numbness. And of course, if you are in a distressed state, if you're feeling very depressed or anxious, and you take something that numbs your emotions, even if it numbs, the evidence is they numb all our emotions, not just negative ones, but also positive ones. But if your emotions are numbed, you're going to register as seeming less depressed on depression rating scales or anxiety rating scales, or at least you may do. And that effect may or may not be useful, but it's going to have some sort of impact on people. And what I'm saying is that's a much more plausible explanation of what happens when people take these drugs than the idea that they target some hypothetical biological mechanism that hasn't actually been demonstrated.
So you say, let's take the serotonin as an example. The lack of serotonin has never been demonstrated. Somebody might say, well, because we haven't looked enough, we need to keep looking, right? Is that because we didn't do enough research that the serotonin deficiency has not been proven, or because it's not there?
Yeah. So you can't ever prove a negative. So, it's always possible that people could do more research and find some links. But in 2022, I published a paper along with some colleagues, which reported on a review that we did of all the main areas of research that have looked for possible links between serotonin and depression. We looked at research on serotonin levels in the blood, for example. We looked at research on the serotonin metabolite in the cerebrospinal fluid, the fluid in the spinal column that's linked to the fluid in the brain, which is probably the most direct way of assessing serotonin in the brain. In humans, you can't stick needles into people's brains and measure the serotonin levels directly. We looked at studies that have looked at the serotonin receptor, at the protein that transports serotonin out of the gap between the nerve cells, the synapse, where it has its activity. We looked at studies on the gene for the transporter protein, and we looked at studies that have tried to see whether you can induce depression in people by indirectly lowering brain serotonin levels using dietary manipulations. And basically we found that none of those areas provided consistent or convincing evidence that serotonin is linked with depression. Of course, there were some positive studies, but if you looked at the research overall, there were lots of negative studies too, and overall you couldn't conclude that any links had been demonstrated.
And so what's your opinion about, how this idea that there is a serotonin deficiency in the brain became dominant? Because the medical model, or as you call it in your book, the disease model of mental health difficulties, there is one, but you say there is no evidence that there is one.
Yeah. So this model became dominant basically because of the power and money of the pharmaceutical industry. It's a very easy question to answer. They didn't invent the model. The model was invented by psychiatrists and researchers back in the 1960s who were keen to have a drug that they believed was a specific drug for depression. So they alighted on some drugs that they thought might be useful to give to people with depression. They thought that these drugs showed some useful effects. I would question that. The research was quite fundamentally flawed, but nevertheless, they thought they had found some drugs that were useful in depression, and then they came up with a theory to explain why they might be useful in depression, and they came up with this theory that depression was that the depression had a chemical basis that the drugs could help, could rectify, could reverse. First of all, the interest was in the brain chemical called noradrenaline. So the initial theory was that depression was caused by a lack of noradrenaline in the brain, but then people also suggested that serotonin might be involved. In the 1970s, the American government research funding agency set up a big study to look at the biology of depression and to do studies to look at whether there were any abnormalities in noradrenaline and serotonin in the brains of people with depression. They never published any results of those studies. So I can only assume, because they seem to be very enthusiastic about the idea that there might be abnormalities, that they didn't find any. So by the 1980s, it looked like this idea was, had run its course and should be abandoned. But then in the late 1980s, the pharmaceutical industry came along and they had a new range of drugs that they wanted to market as replacements for the benzodiazepines, which were their current bestsellers at that time. Benzodiazepines had got a very bad reputation by the 1980s because it had become apparent that large numbers of the population had become dependent on them and were having real difficulty getting off them. And so the pharmaceutical industry recruited this idea that depression was due to a chemical imbalance to promote their new range of drugs, the SSRI antidepressants, the first one being Prozac, followed by Paxil and Lustril and things like that. Zoloft.
Very common to these days.
Still very commonly prescribed drugs. And they promoted them alongside the idea that what they were doing was not numbing people or doping people up a bit like the benzodiazepines had been doing, but targeting an underlying chemical imbalance. So this idea helped them to distinguish the SSRIs from the benzodiazepines, and it helped persuade people that taking a drug for an emotional problem is a good idea, because people really weren't convinced at that time that it was a good idea. They'd seen what benzodiazepines had done to people, and they had started to question this whole strategy. And this chemical imbalance idea helped to silence people's questions. And so there was basically a deluge of marketing directed at doctors and then at the general public, directly through advertisements in the US, more indirectly in Europe and other countries via online websites and groups that were promoted, online groups that were promoted or supported by the pharmaceutical industry.
Okay, so the SSRI are different than the benzodiazepine.
Yes, so SSRIs, so benzodiazepines are drugs that were mainly given to people with anxiety. They are sedative substances, a bit like alcohol. We now know that they are very likely to make people dependent, and people have difficulty coming off them. Some people like taking them, so they are used recreationally by some people too. The SSRIs are a different range of drugs. They have a different chemical structure and different activities, different actions. They don't sort of heavily sedate people like the benzodiazepines, but they do usually make people a little bit lethargic, a bit apathetic, and sometimes, but conversely, they don't really help with sleep. They can often actually cause insomnia. So they're not a good drug for sleep
problems. They're still kind of sedatives.
But they numb people. I think that's one of their main effects. Probably one of their most consistently demonstrated effects is the impairment of sexual function, and they particularly cause genital anesthesia, so numbing of the genital area. Yes. So I think they have a general numbing or desensitizing effect, and that applies both to sexual feelings and to emotions.
And in order to sell it, let's say, or to convince people to use it, they kind of bought into this idea that they were fixing a chemical imbalance in the brain. But this chemical imbalance in the brain has never been found, never been proven, and yes. Like a myth, right?
Yes, absolutely. So the pharmaceutical industry basically recruited this idea in order to overcome people's natural caution about taking a drug that affects the brain in order to deal with their mental problems, and in some of the pharmaceutical industry propaganda, they did acknowledge that this wasn't proven. So they might say something like, depression may be caused by a chemical imbalance.
Yeah, they use the conditional.
Yeah, But often they didn't say that. They just said depression has been linked to a chemical imbalance. And even when they did, they sort of skirted over that. And they said it so many times that it seemed as if it was, if not completely proven, pretty well proven.
Okay, so let's say, okay, depression has not been proven, but for sure, things like schizophrenia and bipolar, there must be a chemical imbalance in the brain that cause them. Is that being proven?
No. So there's no biological mechanism has been found for any mental disorder, including anxiety and depression, but also schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. We should maybe acknowledge that these terms are these diagnoses are simply labels for collections of symptoms, and by symptoms we mean unwanted feelings and unwanted behavior that someone doesn't want. It may not be the individual themselves. And so these labels, these diagnoses, are undoubtedly likely to capture a huge variety of situations, and possibly I would say some of those may have some sort of biological mechanism. Certainly, for example, when you see very severe depression in elderly people, some of those people will turn out to have the beginnings of dementia or some sort of neurological problem. But in general, we have not found a biological mechanism that explains schizophrenia or bipolar disorders, despite many decades of looking for one.
Okay, so it's not like they've done one or two studies, many decades
of
studies. Okay, that, is very shocking, but very, very good to know. And it's very important for people to know. They can choose if they want to take psychiatric medications or not, because the message that get often given to people is that you have a chemical imbalance in the brain, this will fix it, take it. And some people do get some relief from these medications. And how would you explain that? Because then they do work.
First of all, it depends on the situation and it depends on the drug. So first of all, talking about depression and antidepressants, as I've suggested, the antidepressants that are commonly prescribed at the moment, the SSRIs, have a numbing effect, so that can reduce the intensity of someone's feelings. And that some people may find that to be helpful. But we also know that giving someone a pill for depression or anxiety or any other, certainly any other of that sort of emotional problem, has a significant placebo effect. That is, a lot of people get better because they think they're taking something that's going to help them. And of course, people naturally get better from something like depression and anxiety because these conditions fluctuate, they come and go. That's the nature of them. It's always been known that that's the nature of them. And so I think that many people feel that they have improved after taking an antidepressant because they have improved due to other reasons, either because they were just coming out of the depression anyway, or because there was something that they did at the same time as taking the antidepressant that made them feel better. Maybe at the same time they started on the antidepressant, they thought, right, I'm going to sign up to a gym and start taking regular exercise. Or maybe they thought, okay, I've really got to do something about my job because it's getting me down. So often people start taking an antidepressant at their lowest point, when they've really hit rock bottom. And that is also a point at which they often realize that they need to make some changes in their life. They've got to address what's really getting them down. And therefore, what I'm saying is that often people get better when they start taking an antidepressant coincidentally because of other things that are happening.
Or just this numbing effect help them maybe temporarily to make changes in their lives.
The reason that I'm not sure that the numbing effect is that helpful is because the clinical trials of antidepressants show that they are really barely different from taking a placebo. The difference in the in terms of people's outcome is that people who take an antidepressant, their depression score on the common depression rating scale, which is 54 points in total, decreases by about 2 points more than people who take a placebo. So it's a very small difference. And it's probably also explained by the fact that these trials are not securely double-blind, that many people will be able to guess whether they're getting the real drug or the antidepressant, and therefore people on the antidepressant will get a sort of amplified placebo effect. So I just feel that the clinical trial evidence suggests that antidepressants, even with that emotional numbing property, which might in theory sound as if it's helpful for people, are probably not helpful.
Okay, and what do you tell me? Can you tell me about then antipsychotics or mood stabilizers?
So the use of antipsychotics for people with psychosis is a different situation with a different set of considerations to weigh up. So antipsychotics are also drugs that numb emotions, but they do so much more powerfully, and at the same time as numbing emotions, they slow down people's thought processes and their physical activity. So if someone is really intensely psychotic and aggressive, for example, and you give them a big dose of an antipsychotic, they will calm down and be less aggressive and more manageable. So that's one way in which antipsychotics are used for that behavioral modification. But I think they also can be helpful in reducing the intensity of psychotic symptoms. If someone's mental life has been taken over by preoccupying, repetitive thoughts, delusional ideas that someone is after them, and hallucinations, suppressing that activity can be useful. You're not just suppressing that activity, you're suppressing people's other thoughts and feelings, and that's partly why people find these drugs so unpleasant. But I think there are situations where the positives of having those thoughts suppressed outweigh the negatives.
Like in a crisis.
When someone's acutely psychotic and nothing else has helped, is what I would say, because some people come out of psychosis naturally, and ideally we should be supporting people to see if that will happen. And there are some projects around the world that have done that, such as the Soteria project in America, and there are various other Soteria facilities around the world, where people who are psychotic are supported with non-intrusive support to see if they can get through their psychotic episode without drugs, or maybe with sort of very low dose, temporary, short-term use of medication.
Often people who are on antipsychotics or on mood stabilizer, they're told that they need to take it for life.
Yeah. So I would say that there probably are some people who have chronic, enduring psychotic symptoms for whom long-term antipsychotics can be useful. But there are also many people who have episodic episodes of psychosis who might well be able to come off their antipsychotics when they get better, and then take them the next time they have an episode, if indeed they get one. The problem is that once people are on long-term antipsychotics, it can be difficult to get off them, because the process of coming off an antipsychotic may actually induce a psychotic episode in itself. So people do relapse when you take people off antipsychotics, and maybe for some people that can be mitigated by reducing the drugs very slowly, very, very gradually over a number of years.
Yes, okay. So that in fact was my next question. So what would be like the pros and cons of taking, let's differentiate that, like an antidepressant or an anxiolytic on one side, or a mood stabilizer or antipsychotic on the other? Pros and cons.
Yeah. So thinking about antidepressants, as I've said, I'm not really sure that I'm not convinced they have any benefits. They certainly have some significant adverse effects for some people. So they cause dependence quite commonly, and some people really can find them very difficult to get off and can get into a very nasty, protracted withdrawal state, particularly if they come off them too quickly. They cause sexual dysfunction, and in some people, sexual dysfunction persists after they've stopped taking the drug. This has been recognized recently. It's called persistent post-SSRI sexual dysfunction. And the most recent survey of the prevalence of this condition suggested it may be over 10% of people who will get this condition. So that's a very significant consideration, I would say, that should really put people off taking antidepressants. It's likely that these adverse effects are more common in people who've taken them long term. So I would always say that, if people are considering taking antidepressant medication, take it for as short a time as you can possibly get away with. But there are reports of this persistent sexual dysfunction in people who've only taken them short term too. And then there are other complications of antidepressants like bleeding, that they seem to increase suicidal thoughts in young people. I don't think that's a very common effect, but it's certainly been shown in randomized controlled trials.
Yeah, so you do not want to give to a depressed young person something that increases.
Exactly. So I think we need to be very wary about that. They seem to, I think it seems strange, but it's linked to their numbing. They seem to sort of disinhibit people. They're a bit numbed, but also just a bit disinhibited. And so sometimes people can do quite impulsive things. And then some people also talk about having sort of, ruminating on suicide, which they hadn't done before they took the drug. So I'm not convinced that that antidepressants are worthwhile in any situation, because I should add, a lot of people think, well, they must be good in severe depression, but there's no good evidence that they're useful in severe depression either. Then with antipsychotics, I think the pros and cons are a bit different, because psychosis can be, an overwhelming state, and I think the evidence that antipsychotics can suppress psychotic symptoms is reasonably good. So I think for people who are acutely psychotic and for who are not coming out of that psychosis and other supportive measures are not working, I think it's worth trying antipsychotics. They do have very significant adverse effects, though. They can cause neurological effects, cardiac effects. They're associated with brain volume shrinkage.
Brain volume,
hormonal effects, weight gain, metabolic effects, probably shorten people's lives. So there's very considerable adverse effects, but nevertheless, I think there are some situations where people are, so psychotic and so cut off from reality that it is worth trying them. I would suggest people should try and take them short term only if possible, but probably there will be some people who need to take them long term. Of course, again, taking them long term increases the risk of adverse effects. So it's a reason why would try and minimize that.
So what would you advise to people who are on psychiatric medication and would like to come off them?
So inform yourself about the effects of the particular drug you're on, all the effects, how it changes mental and physical states. Of course, it's difficult to find that information because all the research has been so focused on how drugs are reversing hypothetical underlying mechanisms. But there's my work and plenty of it. There are books, but there's also plenty online available, and there are other people who've written about this sort of thing. So inform yourself about the effects of the particular drug that you're taking, and then weigh up whether those effects are likely to be useful in your particular situation. So if you're taking an SSRI and it's likely one of the effects is numbing, is a bit of numbing useful for you or not useful for you? That's the first question you need to ask, and then you need to ask if you think it is a bit useful for you, does the utility outweigh the risks of dependence, persistent sexual dysfunction, and all the other adverse effects of antidepressants? If you decide that it doesn't, and you'd rather not be on the drug, then go and see your doctor and devise a gradual reduction program. The longer you've been taking something, generally, the more gradual that will have to be. Start off with a small reduction, see whether you get any withdrawal effects, and that can determine sort of how fast you start withdrawing. But people should always reduce slowly when they get down to lower doses.
And it's the same for antidepressant or any other psychiatric medication.
So, and yes, coming off any sort of drug, depends on the withdrawal, depends on how long you've been taking it, and should be done gradually and more gradually as you get down to the lower doses. And if your doctor doesn't know how to do that, which of course is quite common, there are some resources you can direct them towards. So the UK's Royal College of Psychiatrists have a page on stopping antidepressants, which has some useful guidance in it. And my colleague, Dr. Mark Horowitz, has just produced the Maudsley Deprescribing guidelines, which gives very detailed evidence on how to come off antidepressants, benzodiazepines, and similar drugs.
Okay, and I will link the websites in the episode notes. Can I ask, if there is no evidence, why psychiatrists, doctors are so convinced, and they in good art prescribe these medications to people?
I think the problem is that we convince ourselves about things that we want to believe, and psychiatrists want to believe that mental disorders have a biological basis because it justifies their role in the mental health system. And that's particularly important nowadays when health budgets are being constrained and there is competition for non-medical management such as psychotherapy. So psychotherapy can be done much cheaper by a non-medically qualified person, but drug treatment can't be done by anyone else generally. So I think that's really the center of it. Of course, the pharmaceutical industry stands to make money out of this, this way of thinking about mental health problems, and has been influencing the medical profession for a long time. Also, I think there's a political imperative towards this way of thinking as well, because it's easier to blame the brain than it is to blame society for politicians. It's easier for politicians to think this is a medical problem, people need antidepressants or whatever, than to have to ask themselves why so many people are so distressed in our modern society, and what political changes might need to be made to address that. If we take a non-biological approach to something like depression, for example, what we are saying is that depression is a human emotional reaction. It's an emotion. It's a human response, and it's a response. It's a way that human beings react to their environment, and therefore, to understand someone's emotional state, you need to understand their circumstances. You can't just look at the individual and look at the individual brain. You have to understand what's going on for this person now that they should feel unhappy or anxious, or indeed psychotic, and what's maybe happened in their past that has led to this as well.
And it's like, when you plant a plant and the plant doesn't flourish, you don't blame the plant. You look at the environment around the plant. Exactly. So what could be an alternative approach to human suffering?
So the alternative is to, first of all, identify what people are reacting to, what's gone wrong for them in their lives that has made them anxious or depressed, and that can be many different things. There's no universal
absolutely
solution.
Yeah.
And it may be that someone's having relationship difficulties at work. Maybe they were abused as a child and that's affected their self-esteem. And often it's a combination of these things. So what I say is I think therapy can be very helpful, and one of the ways it can be helpful is to help people identify what is making them distressed in the first place, because sometimes people don't really understand that. But also I would say that not everyone needs therapy, and it may be that you just need to go and change your job or get out of a bad relationship. When people are struggling with financial issues, with debt, with unemployment, with lack of housing, all these things are very difficult for individuals or therapists to deal with, and really need a political solution. Yeah,
exactly. So I can see how it's easier just take this pill, you'll feel better than changing the system or society overall.
But when you put it like that, I think you highlight how immoral it is, really. I mean, the idea that we're giving people pills to numb them to really difficult circumstances seems to me to be the wrong way to conduct treatment, the wrong way to help people.
And I know you just or recently published a new book, which is called Chemically Imbalanced, which look at depression and antidepressant and all of that. Do you want to tell us a bit about it?
So it's called Chemically Imbalanced, the making and unmaking of the serotonin myth. So it covers some of the things that we've talked about today, plus some other things like goes a bit more into the history of the chemical imbalance idea and of antidepressants, where they came from, looks in detail at the research on antidepressants, and it looks at what is in store in the future, including some other substances such as psychedelics, but also some benzodiazepine and opioid-like substances that are coming online for the treatment of depression that we ought to be concerned about. And it also puts forward a different view.
Where can people find these books? Where they can buy them?
So the books are available on Amazon, an ebook as well for people who are not in the UK, because otherwise I think it has to be shipped from the UK. And some of my previous books have been translated into various other languages. I have a website that you can look up, which I've written some blogs on as well. That's at joannamoncrieff.com, and the blogs cover various other issues, like sort of overlap between recreational and prescription drugs, like the history of psychiatry, the philosophy of mental disorder. And I am also on X. People could follow me on X and B-Sky. Okay,
so I will get all the links of you and put them all in the episode notes. Is there anything that you want to add?
Yes, a final message. I certainly got a final message. Yes, I think people need to inform themselves about any drug that they propose to take, and if they do decide they have to take it in the lowest dose for the shortest possible time.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And I hope that many, many, many people that listen to this podcast will read your book. And I'll see you next time on One on Psychedelics then.
Thank you, Alice. Lovely to talk to you.
Lovely. Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, leave us a great review and share this episode with friends and family. This will help us reach more people and improve more lives. You can also follow crossroads.psychology.uk on Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. Mastering scientifically proven psychological techniques is the most effective and fastest way to overcome the stress, anxiety, and low mood stopping you from creating the life you want to live. And we have plenty of free resources for you to use on the courses page of our website, crossroadspsychology.co.uk. Go and use them. And let me know your thoughts by tagging crossroads.psychology.uk on your socials. I'll see you online.